So for my research project, I chose to, I'm choosing to do an in-depth quantitative analysis on Shabaab and Boko Haram, two terrorist groups centered in sub-Saharan Africa. So the main research questions I want to answer are, first and foremost, which of the two groups is more violent, which I'll specify later on in the presentation, and then also what quantifiable differences exist between their attacks and their targets. And I didn't include this in the slides, but I'll just mention it. The reason I chose this is because, one, over the last year or so, I've become increasingly interested in sub-Saharan Africa and the political and economic landscape in that area, and also because these are terrorist organizations that tend to not get as much media coverage as, say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but they have caused a surprising amount of damage over the years that they've been in existence. So I wanted to find out more about them and look at them more carefully. So first I'll give some quick background info on the two groups. Al-Shabaab, that is a shortened version of the official name, which is really long, but it translates into roughly the youth or the guys. It's an Islamic jihadist fundamentalist group, and they conduct their terrorist attacks in East Africa, particularly Somalia, and also Kenya has been subject to several bombings by them in the past. Then on the opposite end of the continent, we have Boko Haram. They are also a radical Islamist group. Their name translates roughly into Western education is forbidden. And they originated in Nigeria, which is where the majority of their attacks take place, but they also have branched out to some of the surrounding nations like Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. So now the question, why compare the two? They have, in just the initial research I've done up to this point, there are a surprising amount of similarities between the two groups. Like I mentioned, they're both Islamic jihadist groups, both with the ultimate goal of establishing an Islamic state. They're, as I mentioned, based in sub-Saharan Africa, and the preliminary research I've done, the estimates it provides shows that they have a comparable number of fighters and have conducted a comparable number of attacks. So I think comparing them isn't like apples and oranges. They're similar enough that observing the differences between the two can yield some useful information. And so in order to conduct this research, I'll be using the Global Terrorism Database data that we used in the problem set earlier this semester. Some of the variables which are listed at the indented list at the bottom will need to be coded numerically so that I can analyze them using stata. And some of the more particular questions I want to examine that I alluded to previously are, what are the differences between the targets that the groups go for? Does one group focus more on, say, the military or religious institutions, things like that? Are there any differences between the weapons they use, or are they roughly similar? Then are certain weapons more likely to be found used against certain targets? That's just a curiosity I have. And then finally, do certain attacks on targets yield higher fatalities or injuries to the groups themselves or casualties to their victims? So I'll take questions now if anyone has them.
Yeah, I was just curious, there's a lot of differences between Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, like where they operate, Nigeria's a functioning state, basically, Somalia's a failed state. Are there what got you thinking about studying them together?
Let's see. What initially sparked it was a couple of newspaper articles from, I want to say, the Washington Post that compared the two. They did some of a somewhat similar analysis to what I'm talking about, comparing the violence they've engaged in, and I just want to take it a step further to look for more specific connections between the variables.
I think it's interesting when you bring up maybe like different weapons that each group uses, because each of these groups is pretty well known now for using suicide bombers. Like Boko Haram is very famous for using like the largest number of women suicide bombers amongst all terrorist groups. Whereas I was just reading a report last night about Shabaab that talked about how they just recently started using them in like 2009, and it was like a 10-year process. So I think you'll find a lot of good data on that, because each one has like their own methods of justifying it, and each one attacks different targets. So
Yeah.
that's what good luck with that.
So with this information, I guess, like, what are the implications of it? Are you going to talk about like counterterrorism?
I had not planned on that. I think it's just based on the preliminary research I've done, I think it's beyond the scope of this paper.
Okay.
But yeah, it certainly, like this type of analysis certainly could be useful for counterterrorism measures. To the more intelligence, the better. Okay, thank you.